Hello, my name is John Clayton, and over the past few months I have been developing an incredibly ambitious project named Dungeon Diplomat. This game is a combination of city builder and roguelike, where you need to clear out tiles to build on and help expand your city. This video is going to be my first devlog on this project, and just serves an introduction to the game's ideas. To begin, I feel it is important to explain what I mean by a city builder roguelike. Dungeon Diplomat essentially has two systems that the player interacts with. These two systems are the dungeons that the player must clear, and the city builder. I based both of these systems off of other games within the genre, drawing heavy influence from Brotato and Tarot cards, some personal favorites of mine. Don't worry, there are plenty of unique things to this game. My ultimate goal is to develop a unique blend of roguelike mechanics that promises an exciting and fresh gaming experience. In Dungeon Diplomat, the player takes on the role of the town's mayor as they expand its boundaries and transform it from a single tile to a sprawling city while battling monsters along the way. I developed it using the Unity game engine and the C# libraries built into the engine. My target audience for this game is early teens to adults. This is mainly due to the strategy required to make a city that lasts for a while. The gameplay in Dungeon Diplomat is at its core very simple. The player will explore dungeons and construct buildings, all while managing their resources and having to make decisions that can make or break a run. I decided to make this game since I had noticed that there weren't many games, in fact I couldn't find any, that combined both city building and roguelikes. The closest I could find was Dwarf Fortress, but due to its high barrier of entry, mainly due to its complexity, I realized that there was a massive open market. As I mentioned before, there are two main systems at play within the game. These are the dungeons and the city. The dungeons are incredibly simple. All you do is equip the items you want in that run, allowing you to design and make a multitude of builds and fight the monsters. In the future, I want to add more stuff, but more on that later. The city is the more complicated of the two. In it, you have to expand and build on purchased land. Certain buildings cause effects in nearby buildings. For example, the houses cause nearby businesses to produce more money as more people are living in the area. Much like the dungeons, I have a lot more I want to add here, but once again, I'll mention those in a bit. Ultimately, the biggest challenge with the city is keeping track of your resources. There are only two resources in the game, those being money and food, but if you're unable to pay your taxes, the game ends. At this point, I'd like to dive into some of the technical aspects of Dungeon Diplomat, as is usual with devlogs like this. I want to highlight two particularly challenging systems I implemented, diving into how they work, then discussing the challenges and how I overcame them. The first was the inventory system. While on the surface it seems like a relatively simple process to implement, it was far more challenging than it would seem, and this is mainly due to a problem built into Unity. You see, when Unity first initializes a scene, it begins by generating all the game objects, then running the awake and start functions. This is good in general, but if you want something to be present throughout the entire game and you're changing scenes, this can be a hassle to overcome. Initially, this seems like a simple problem. Using the don't destroy on load function, Unity can simply keep the game object between scenes, allowing me to keep the inventory there. But when you reload that scene, suddenly there are two game objects with the same class, so I had to overcome this problem. I decided to use what are called design patterns in Unity. A design pattern is a general, repeatable solution to a commonly occurring problem in software design. In this case, I used the singleton design pattern, which is where there's only one possible instance of a class at a time. What you do is you make a static variable in the script that is an instance of the class, and then when you're loading the scene, you check to see if the instance has already been set. If it hasn't, then make this instance the static instance. If it has, then simply delete the game object. So great, now we have that, but now we have a new problem. When we delete that old object, all of the buttons in the game no longer point toward the game object that has the inventory. Instead, it's pointing towards a null value, and when we click on the button, the game crashes. So how do we overcome this problem? We create another class that will be remade each time we load the scene that handles our inputs, calls the inventory script, and boom, we're done. Now we can interact with the inventory and keep track of our items super easily. The second challenge was getting the city to save and load. A fundamentally similar issue to the inventory, when we load the city building scene, the city needs to be able to generate based on what it already has, which means we once again needed to use the singleton design pattern. But this time, we had a new issue. We had to be able to save and load the city in the state it was in. So first, I needed to be able to create a method of saving the city. To complete this task, I assigned each tile a vector2 int, based on its location, using the traditional coordinate method of going up, increasing the y value, and going right, increasing the x value. Then, I stored what the tile was at that location using a dictionary. This was also helpful with modifying the city and generating new tiles, as I could check to see if there was already a tile at that location using the contains key function, and then either adding or modifying the value at that location. So now we have saving implemented, but we needed to get to also load the city, or else it wasn't actually doing anything that helpful. Surprisingly, this was pretty simple. All I needed to do was at the beginning of the scene, run through each tile in our dictionary, and generate an instance of the building at that location on the tile. Ultimately though, the coding was the easy part for me. The real challenge was making the art and music. While the music hasn't yet been implemented into the game, I plan on adding it very soon, once I have more music for the dungeons. In fact, the background music on this video has been my own music that I plan on using for the city, as it's quite calming in my opinion. Additionally, making the art for this game has been a real challenge. I've been doing pixel art for a while now, but never anything to this large of a scale where I need to make sure it was all cohesive. But expanding my horizons with these kinds of things has been quite fun and a welcome challenge, even if it may be occurring at a somewhat stressful time in my life, with graduation and all. Dungeon Diplomat was originally designed in Figma, an online tool that is designed specifically for developing and brainstorming. There were a lot of ideas in those early days, but I would ultimately have to ask myself how they contributed to my game's ideas, and if I felt that they weren't meaningful contributions, I ultimately cut them, and sat them aside for later, in case I ended up either having the time or figured out some way for them to contribute to the game meaningfully. Once I had all these ideas gathered, I combined them into a single design document, which I frequently referenced for ideas. I also found it important to make multiple diagrams for the program, including entity relationship diagrams, activity diagrams, and use case diagrams, even if they were quite simple. The activity diagram was particularly useful with designing the inventory and saving and loading systems, as it helped me with determining where to have functions run. As you can see, I had multiple different paths based on what the player did. On a printed piece of paper, I had written what functions should be called when loading the city and inventory. The entity relationship diagram was also helpful, as it helped me to determine where things should go once being loaded. Unfortunately, the use case diagram wasn't that useful, but I found they rarely are in regards to game development, as every use case will be very different, and trying to account for everything a player will do can be very challenging. There were a couple of limitations with Unity, but since I'd had plenty of development experience with it, those problems weren't significant. Not to say that there haven't been any issues. One of the most important things to me, however, was to have frequent feedback for balancing and also for bug finding. Alongside this, to help keep me motivated, I frequently would reload old versions of the game to compare to newer versions, to help remind me of how far I'd come in such little time. There were a couple of limitations to my project. Perhaps the largest, and therefore hardest to overcome, was finding the time to actually develop the game. Luckily, I work as a lab assistant at my college, so I had plenty of time to develop the game when I wasn't actively working. Additionally, trying to develop everything myself was a bit of a challenge, and unfortunately, I was unable to reach that goal. While most things in the game were developed by me, including most of the art, some of the art was not. The icons found in the inventory screen, the background on the main menu, and the weapons used in the dungeons were not drawn by me, but everything else in the game was. Additionally, I have fonts that I did not develop. I do plan on eventually making all the art in the game in future installments of these devlogs, but due to time constraints, was unable to. Additionally, some features that I had planned have not yet been implemented, mainly because of the time required to develop them, with little return on investment. Perhaps the biggest example of this is some of the enemy types that I designed and prototyped. So where am I planning on going in the future? Well, I first want to finish everything that I've got at this point, making sure everything is nice and polished. Of these, I want to finish the art and animations, since there are no real animations in the game at this time, sound effects, and some inventory UI tweaks. Additionally, I want to add a save and load system, since it will be possible for the game to run for a decent length of time, and I currently do not have a system for saving and loading the entire game. I'd like to add NPCs that wander the city, that can give simple quests. On this same note, I'd like to add some more custom UIs for certain unique buildings, perhaps where the player can enter and roam the store. I've actually already done a mock-up of one unique building UI. One of the key things I want to make sure the game has is having the player feel immersed within the world, while still allowing them to have ease when it comes to larger cities. Initially, I had it planned that the player would actually walk around the city as it expands, but as I played it, I found that some playtesters, and myself, didn't like the long walks they would have to make, so I changed it to a more traditional city builder UI. Upon entering the storefronts, I want the player to be able to walk around and interact with people. So while I ultimately decided to cut the ability to walk around the city, some of the work I had done, like writing a script for interactable objects you can walk up to, wasn't in vain. I'm especially excited about this, as it allows me to add in some basic NPCs and lore to the game, which the player can interact with. Overall, I am excited to continue development on Dungeon Diplomat, and hope that you are too. If you'd like to join me and help support me, feel free to like and subscribe, as every little bit counts. And if you have any questions about the game, or would just like to give feedback in general, feel free to comment as well.